Hey, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to look at auto exposure. There's not a lot that I need to cover, but auto exposure is a thing in Twinmotion, and previously in multiple videos, I have gone on long rants that I'm now apologizing for. And just because auto exposure does exist, I was in fact not of the knowledge that it did exist. So I apologize for spreading any kind of misinformation that I might have spread. And I, again, apologize for that. I'll continue to do that throughout this video, but I wanted to look at auto exposure, not for the first time myself now, but to share it with you, to let you know that it exists, to let you know how powerful it is and the purpose, why you might want to use it compared to just living life in the auto exposure world. Fortunately for us in our human lives, we don't live in an auto exposed world. And maybe there's some pluses and minuses to that, but regardless. So before we get into auto exposure, if you happen to learn something, which I hope you did, and I hope you will in this case, because I didn't know about auto exposure until a nice user commented on a previous video of mine and said, "Hey, it exists. Here's where it is, dummy." Like essentially saying that. They were nicer about it than that, but like really, it exists, and I want to let you know because I learned something new. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to help you by learning. I'm trying to let you learn through me. So if at any point you happen to learn something, please like the video. Also subscribe. That helps me out. Okay, auto exposure. I'm in just a basic project, and we can tell the lighting's a little off. But really, when it comes down to lighting, you're gonna have to set it up per shot. For whatever you're looking at. In this case, we're just looking down this hall, and that's fine. We're going to set it up to just kind of look at this, and we're going to look at a day shot and a night shot. And, it's different if you're doing a video because you're going to have to kind of think about the scene, where you're looking at, the rooms you're going in holistically. And that's fine. And you can apply what you learned in this video to that. But we're going to look at just kind of this one shot, the static shot, change the time of day from day to night, and see how auto exposure impacts that, and then how we can use that to our advantage by turning it off in this case. So where is auto exposure? And I can't believe that it didn't hit me. Obviously it's in the settings, and then lighting, of course, again, and then exposure, but there's a more option. If you've seen these more options, I'm sure you have, and I have too, but lo and behold, auto exposure on and off. And we could see what happens here. So let's put auto exposure on. And when I put it on, you could say maybe it looks better. It looks a little more crisp. There's a little more contrast. Yeah, but it is what it is. Essentially what auto exposure is doing, it's taking your lightest value and your darkest value and kind of balancing them out. And so you can see that we have like some blacks in the scene. You can also see we have some like almost whites. And that's just, because we're covering the spectrum. And the idea is that Twinmotion is allowing us to see everything in the view and not blowing anything out. It's not making things look too dark. We're not looking down a dark hallway, nothing like that. It's balancing everything out so you can see. And the thing about auto exposure is that if I were to move and look somewhere else, it will technically balance it out again. And you can see that most whenever I change the time of day, it will rebalance that out. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll change this just to a different time of day. And we can most definitely see this as we move more towards the night. So we can see that, it looks kind of funny. It looks a little weird. And that has a lot to do with the auto exposure. So let's put this back into some time in the afternoon. And we can see auto exposure's on, and with it off, what happens? Well, I get this kind of singular look, like we could tell it's too bright. That's one, but two, it's more balanced. And by balance, I don't mean like I'm seeing the lightest and the darkest values, but like it looks more normal. And I say that just because everything is a little more brighter than it should be, but it's all consistent at least. So, we could quickly combat that by turning the exposure down, and maybe that's too much, maybe just one, but that's not bad. That may or may not be what I want to do in this case, because I don't necessarily like just jacking with the exposure, like completely up, completely down. I don't like doing that. because generally there are other settings that we can start to look at, whether it's individual lights, reflection probes, things like that, other lighting settings that are more global than just doing this. I don't want to just bring this value up or down just to see what I want to see. I don't want to have to do that. And anyways, but again, the point of auto exposure is that it's going to balance everything out and allow you to see what you're going to see, what's there, what's in your view. It's nice for that, but for presentation purposes, I like to turn it off. And I've applied this in Enscape before. I've looked at other Enscape does have auto exposure, and it's on or off. You have the option of doing that just like you do in Twinmotion. And I've gone through why you might want to do it there, but I will do it again. It applies the same. Auto exposure being off means you're getting the true values of the light settings that you input yourself. And what I mean is, for example, if we go to one of these lights and I click on one of these lights, this intensity, 1500 lumens from a particular light with auto exposure off, it's actually doing that. It's emitting 1500 lumens of light. And I know that, and I can trust that because auto exposure is off. Now, again, if I come and I turn auto exposure on, all that is going to do is balance the lights out. So if I'm in a dark room, like literally a boxed room with no windows, nothing, and I turn auto exposure on, we're going to go through that here. I've got a different project we can look at from a previous video that will show this. But if I'm in this dark room with no windows in the middle of the day, it shouldn't be bright. And with auto exposure, it will like balance out the light so you can see what's in the room. Now that's great and all, but turning auto exposure off and you wanted to like showcase a particular light, with auto exposure off, you could see how that light is performing as the light settings are set up for that particular light. So you're going to see the true values for that. And so that's the whole point, and that's the whole reason why I would recommend you using having auto exposure off. It just doesn't make sense if you're going through all these different light settings to have to deal with every time you change the time of day or something that the lighting just changes in your scene. That's not good. You want some consistency, and the only consistency that you would get with auto exposure is that it's going to auto expose, and we don't necessarily want that. So again, we're going to look through some examples here as I change the time of day, what's going to happen. So I am in the middle of the day, and this doesn't look bad. There are a few other things that we can do. The main thing here is, I don't like to necessarily change the exposure values itself. I kind of want to use that as a last resort, like a final tweaking. And I don't want to have to like really change it by large numbers. I want it to be very small, if at all. White balance doesn't matter so much, at least for what we're going through. Of course, it's just going to change it from a warmer or cooler look. Global illumination, that's fine if you want. We will want to keep that on. If we're going for a sun, it just makes sense. Shadow here. If you want a more crisp shadow, you can see how the edges of my shadow are, really blurred, and that's fine. But if you want a more crisp shadow, bring this down to, probably 50 or below. So I like to put it at 50, and you can see that you get nice crisp shadows, and it looks pretty good. So further settings here. This is the big thing. I think your sun is going to be set at a 100,000 intensity by default. And I believe your sun reflection is 0.92 by default. And the sun reflection won't have a big impact on the lighting, but the sun intensity is huge. It's ridiculous. And I think this is much too high. And again, we could always come back here to exposure and just bring it down. But still, like there's so much contrast. And that contrast is coming from the fact that that sun value is so high, so intense. So I think this is ridiculous, and I would never put it there. I would always bring this down like way low. And I mean, I don't like, obviously if you turn it off, essentially bringing it down, you're going to lose the sun. It's like you're on a planet that has no star. Doesn't make sense. So bringing this up just enough, and by just enough, I mean, like you have sun in the view and you can see that it's making shadows, doing everything like that. Great. Like this is looking pretty good. Now, some of these weird looks that I'm getting, I believe have to do with my reflection probes. So let's go ahead and update those. The thing about reflection probes and lighting and all that is that if I change the sun or anything, you'll want to update those reflection probes. Now, maybe I should have used squares as well, or cubes as well. Next time I'll do that, but updating these will hopefully give us an even more consistent look. May or may not have a giant impact, but once these are updated, so there we go. That looks a lot better, I'd say. We're getting more true shadows and reflections. That looks good. I'll change the time of day just a bit. So with all these settings, my exposure is still at 0. I've really taken a look at the sun intensity. We can start to look at the ambient. If you're in a darker area and you want more ambient, basically more light from all of your lights, but not like the direct light, ambient being indirect, then this makes more sense, and you can really see how the impact that it has is pretty good. Now, I don't need that much, so I'm pretty happy with the default and looks pretty good. So I like this. So the last thing we want to do is just go to our reflection probes and update them one more time. And it's kind of the last thing I always do, just as common practice before I export or do anything. Now, if you have the setting for reflection probes as to update when you export, don't worry about this, but I just like to do that so I can see what I'm looking at. So that looks pretty good for a day, daytime shot. Looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and come back to settings, and I'm going to turn on auto exposure, and we're going to see what happens. So knowing that these settings look good, let's turn auto exposure on and see what happens. Again, I don't like this because it's a little too dark. There's too much contrast, and these lights aren't doing a lot, and it looks like it's almost dark outside in some places. So, again, that's clearly why I like auto exposure off, and it makes more sense. You get the true values of these lights and all of your lighting. You can trust it. So finally, now let's go to a night shot, and this is where we can really start to see some of the impact working here. So let's go to the night, middle of the night, probably 2, 3 in the morning. And so the first thing and last thing I want to do, especially when changing the time of day drastically like this, is update my reflection probes. So these reflection probes still think they're in the day. So let's update those, and we can see that they will update, and we're probably going to get a bit of a darker looking shot. We could get lucky, and it's pretty close also. So there we go. This is true night. It's dark. It's pitch black. We don't have the sun to worry about. And we've got lights that need probably boosting or something like that. So let's first go to the lighting. And again, the last thing I want to do probably is just hard change the exposure. Of course, we can always bring this up, and that's not too bad, but I don't want to do that. There are better ways to go about this, I'm sure. So looking at settings, the sun intensity doesn't do much. The star intensity does not do much. That is more as if you're looking up in the sky. Ambient will do something, but not as much because we don't have a lot of light to work with yet. So this is where we start to get into actually beefing up some of these lights themselves. We could do it that way. We can always go to the exposure, which again, I want to probably avoid. So this is going to allow us to tweak our lights, to get the real lighting. And so a lot of times what you do is you just turn auto exposure on. When we do that, we can see what happens. It'll get us close, but again, we want to use the basic light values. So the reason this must be blown out is because of reflection probes. And my guess is if I update these again with auto exposure on, I'm going to get something a little closer. And so just be wary about your reflection probes, because it's likely that you'll need to update those whenever you're addressing some of these exposure and lighting changes. So I didn't do a whole lot. And it just means that I have a lot of light, and the auto exposure is not really taking the lights into account. It's just taking the values. So again, another reason why I don't like auto exposure, it's going to just by default seem to blow out a lot of different things. So we'll want to turn that off again. I don't necessarily want that on, of course. So turning that off looks pretty good. We'll update these reflection probes one more time, and we'll start to dive into some of these lights, because at this point we're going to have to look at the lights individually, and just knowing that we need to boost some of the lights, we can really get the true value of some of the lights that we would need. So if I have all of these lights in the center, they should obviously be emitting more light than they are. What you're seeing is just the glowing material, not necessarily the light. So the main thing here is to look at these lights and boost them up. And this will tell you, what kind of light you need as far as performance, intensity, everything. Maybe this needs to be more like 3,000 lumens, because this is, 25, 30 feet in the air. maybe that's something. Maybe that's not enough. We can come back to that. I've got other lights that just serve as kind of area lights, and we'll boost those up as well. And I'm not trying to like create just a bunch of light that's artificially blown out or artificially really intense, but you'll see a lot of lights that are pretty intense and that do have a lot of impact on spaces. And the idea is that we sort of get close to those. So here's some more lights, more area lights, and we can see these lights, 1,500. That's not a ton. We're getting there, but 2,000 can start to lighten things up, maybe 3,000. And we get to a point where you're like, okay, it's starting to look good. It makes sense. I think going beyond 4,000 probably is way too much. And so really at this point, we're going back to the lighting settings. And, we could always boost the ambient, and we'll have more impact from the ambient based on the amount of light we've added. But again, still not a lot. And so there are times like this, like we've kind of tried everything that we want to do. We don't want to like severely increase these lights so much that they're 10,000 lumens, because you're not going to find that unless it's like the most intense light ever. And for what this is, just these ceiling lights, you're not going to find that. So at this point, I will probably go to an exposure, and just putting it at 1 makes a big difference. 1.5 makes a big difference. And so you can start to see how, as a last resort, I'm fine doing this, and it makes sense. And this isn't like the best shot in the world. I'm not particularly 100% about this, but it's not bad. So again, we'll update our reflection pros one more time. Maybe we'll get more of a balance, maybe not, but still, this isn't bad for a night shot. Knowing that the sun's not out, it's pitch black, and auto exposure's off. I'm getting the true values of what we're looking at. The reflection probe update did a bit, but really, this isn't too bad. It's pretty good, and I hope by now in this video, you've gotten an idea of why you might want to use auto exposure and why you might not, because it's pretty clear to me that we don't want to. And it makes sense as to why it's in the program. It makes sense as to why it exists, and also why it's on by default, because, if you find yourself in an empty room with no windows, fully closed, you might want to see what's going on in there by default. And that makes sense. I'm not going to knock Twinmotion for that. It makes sense. But knowing that it exists is great. And again, I want to apologize for putting out a couple of videos that don't quite show that. Let's now go to a previous video I've done that was like a showcase where I showed multiple lights in an enclosed room, and we can look at the dramatic difference that we start to get with auto exposure on and off. So if you're watching this video, you're getting the exclusive first look at the lighting showcase room, whatever. And this is I say that because it's for a video coming out later this week, where I will talk about auto exposure in a wrong way. Like, clearly, I haven't discovered it when I made the previous video. But we're in this room, and again, it's fully enclosed. I've got a couple chairs and lights that I have gone through correctly setting up the correct intensity and everything, and like it's what I want as far as the lights. But I have auto exposure on, I'm sure. And so at this point, we need to deal with that. Basically, we're going to see what happens when I turn it off, and we can get the actual true look of the lights. So off. Okay, it's off. This seems a bit dark, and of course it is dark because it's literally 100% dark. It's black, but the lights aren't really doing that much. And so at this point, knowing that the lights are the correct values, like I've looked at those lights, I don't have much of a choice than to bring the exposure up. And I don't necessarily like doing that again, but really nothing else has an impact. We're in an enclosed room. There's no sun. There's no ambient. It's like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Yeah. So, honestly, what can I do? There's not much I can do at all. None of this. There are no other settings that I can really take advantage of other than the exposure, and I'm going to slowly bring this up, and we can see we do, in fact, get some values. Obviously 15 is too much. 10's a little closer. Maybe 8's a little low. 9, 10. So we're almost back to where we were. You could say, well, what's the point of this? Well, in an application like this, it's almost like a wash, at least from what I can tell, because turning auto exposure on, and having no extra exposure here, really, it does kind of balance it out. And that's almost what you need in this sort of an application. Granted, I don't like that. It just kind of is what it is. You can see that, these aren't intense lights. That's one thing. But the main thing is that they're not intense lights. So you think we would see them in a fully dark room. And so that's, I guess, the issue that I have. So the best that I can tell is that if you're in an application like this, a room that's fully dark, no windows, nothing, middle of the night, I can't say that it's like better to have auto exposure on, but you're going to have to compensate with exposure. Looking at all the other settings, they don't really seem to make a difference. Ambient doesn't, moon intensity doesn't, like nothing does. And now you can start to change some of your lights, but what I've done with these lights is literally match a specific light in the real world that exists. And I have these values. So like, why can't I see the lights? It's clearly an exposure thing, like clearly. And that's just kind of the way it is. So I with it off, I need to probably put it at 10. And so I went ahead and even tried putting in a reflection probe. And obviously we get some nice reflections, but that it doesn't seem to make a difference. And I can't say that I'm fully sure why, and it might just be because we're in a fully enclosed room. Looking at these light settings, again, all these lights are they're set up perfectly the way they actually are in the real world, and like they're real lights. So it's kind of interesting to know that, if you're in this kind of an application, you will need to either turn auto exposure on or, bring this exposure value way up. I probably will still have this auto exposure off just to know that the lights are set up the way I want as far as their specific intensity. But when it comes to this exposure, I'll have to do it just sort of globally. So with this off, or with the exposure down to 0 and exposure on, it kind of looks the same. You're going to say, like, what's the point? I don't know. For this application, it's very different because we don't have any sort of outside light, anything working for us at all. And so that might be something to deal with. So the final thing I want to try is just adding an area light or any sort of light, this omnidirectional light, and just kind of dumping it into my scene so I can see it right there, but I want it off the ground. So I'll put it here and we'll just put it off the ground. And it's big enough to fill my room, but you can see the intensity is really low. Now, of course, if this were some other sort of light, it would probably have a higher intensity. But this is something I wanted to point out too. Now, the lights I must have been working with were probably meant for like smaller rooms, smaller applications, like task lights, something like that, or just sort of ambient lights off to the side, because the luminance values that you would expect to see in a light do vary a lot. So I did want to bring this into play. So this is a chart that's looking at just a single light bulb and what we're kind of used to. So basically 100 watt incandescent bulb is 1600 lumens, 2600 lumens. And this is just one. And I mean, this is just a go by, but we can kind of start to understand why some of these lights, being the values that they are very low and we can't see them because the lumen values are so low and the intensity is low, and it obviously makes sense. I'm putting them down here, and so like these are just tiny little bulbs, and if you have a normal 150 watt bulb and you're trying to light up a room, it makes sense that you would need much more intensity than what I've been showing. So let's go ahead and we'll make this omnidirectional light as if it were a 1600 lumen or a 100 watt or 150 watt bulb, and we can see what it looks like. So putting this up to 1600, it kind of looks like a dim light bulb in a room. Like it kind of is what it is. But if we want to put this at 2600, again, it's starting to look like a real light. And so if I put it against one of these walls, that looks like a light bulb against the wall, which is kind of cool. And that's nice. And this is with the auto exposure off. Now we'll see what happens if I put auto exposure back on, because that has a lot to do with what we would see. So turning this on, I mean, clearly this is going to blow out the scene, and this is by no means that bright of a light. It's one bulb. It's 150 watts. That's not a lot. It's enough to, give light into a room, not excessively though, not like this. So this is also why I'd want auto exposure off. And so, we've looked at a bunch of different situations, and we're not going to solve every situation in this video, but auto exposure will definitely help. If you turn it off and try to get more true values in what you're looking for. Of course, at this point, we might still need to play with the exposure a bit. If we're looking at just this one light in particular, we might need to bring this up one or two, to make it just look a little more real and to light up the scene how we want. But that's okay. So that will do it for this video. I spent the entire video talking about auto exposure and clarifying that I had previously said it doesn't exist and it's not in Twinmotion, but I was in fact wrong. So I apologize to that. Thank you to a particular commenter who told me it does exist and where it is, and that made me feel as dumb as I could possibly feel, but I wanted to let you know that it exists, and we looked through a number of different situations on how you might want to deal with auto exposure being off to get the true values of light in your scene. So if you did happen to learn something, which I hope you did, and obviously I learned something because it exists, then please demolish that like button. It helps me out. Also, subscribe. That does as well. So there will be lots more lighting videos in Twinmotion to come because there's a lot to look at. We have to deal with auto exposure and lots of other lighting settings. I hope to see you in all of those. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.